Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank you for allowing the full reading of the resolution, as this is an exceptionally auspicious occasion, since it's the 80th anniversary of the day that President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And we call this day our Day of Remembrance so that we never forget. But first, I want to say that I honor the indigenous people who inhabited our beautiful state since time immemorial. I honor and respect each thread of the American fabric of the story of Native American genocide, culturecide, African American enslavement and human trafficking, the story of Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Latinx Americans, Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, Hindi, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, and all the immigrants who came to America who were driven by hope. I respect that everyone, and we all have our personal and community stories of hardship, hope, and happiness to tell and to share, so we all grow together. So acknowledging all of that, I humbly offer the story of my Japanese Americans community. I'll just call us JAs from now on, because that's how we refer to ourselves. But I want to offer our story through the lens of Executive Order 9066, which now touches 5 generations of JAs. So we have a phrase, Okage sama de, which means I am who I am because of you, my parents and my ancestors. Executive Order 9066 brought armed soldiers to the front doorsteps of my parents, my grandparents, uncles, aunties, and in fact, our entire community throughout the West Coast, all of whom were forcibly removed from their homes and shipped out to live in American concentration camps scattered around the country. And there were 10 of these camps around the country and numerous smaller ones. My family happened to be in Minidoka, which is in southern Idaho. They had no trial, no accusations of wrongdoing, no jury, and in fact had no due process at all. All of their civil rights were taken away with the stroke of a pen. So the resolution we're considering now captures the essence of the forced relocation and incarceration of my community and touches on how our community responded. And the JA community is like any other community, really. People responded in different ways. But above all, there was a sense of the greater good, of being a good American. To many, that meant volunteering to fight for America, even though they were volunteering from behind barbed wire and guard towers. These volunteers were formed into a segregated unit, as was outlined in the resolution, which later became known as the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team. I've spoken of them before on this floor, and their war stories are legendary. And just to highlight a few of them, they have the Vosges Mountains campaign along the German border, where Hitler ordered his troops to defend that border at all costs. They rescued the Lost Battalion. They broke through the Gothic line in northern Italy at Mount Folgorito. They helped liberate Jews at Dachau death camp. And there's many stories of the agony, heroism, self-sacrifice, and even self-reflection behind these campaigns that I could talk about, but today really isn't one of those types of days. I'd be happy to share some of those stories with you on the side and maybe in future days of remembrance. But I want to get back to being an American. Okage sama de. There were other JAs who fought to defend the Constitution, not just in the war front abroad, but here on the homeland. They fought to defend the Constitution by defying the executive order, and in doing so risked jail, perhaps treason charges, perhaps their own lives. I want to pay respects to many great people of conscience on the home front, and acknowledge how their efforts were also so crucial in making me who I am. Of course, there's Fred Korematsu, Min Yasui, Gordon Hirabashi, who are all mentioned in the resolution, all received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and later in life kept on standing up for civil rights, fighting to protect our Constitution. But there are also allies of conscience in the larger society. Many of you may not have heard of Governor Ralph Carr of Colorado, who knew it wasn't popular to defend the Japanese Americans. And he ultimately paid the ultimate political price for doing so, because it was so unpopular at that time. But he took a principled stand. Elmo Smith, who was mayor of Ontario, Oregon, welcomed Japanese Americans into Ontario, Oregon, which is why there's such a large Japanese community in Ontario. And, you know, our colleagues, Senator Conway and Senator Honeyford, both hail from Ontario, and they can tell you some of these stories from post-World War II, during World War II and shortly thereafter. Many Jays took the lessons of Executive Order 9066 and fought for freedom and justice for all long after the war. People like the legal defense teams for Hirabayashi and the Presidential Medal of Freedom awardees. There was Todd Endo, who answered the call of Dr. King and marched in Selma. There was Kiyoshi Kuromiya, who was a Japanese American author and civil rights and anti-war activist who was born in Heart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming and became an aide to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a prominent opponent of the Vietnam War during the 60s. There's Yuri Kuchiyama, who was incarcerated in Jerome War Relocation Center in Arkansas, who worked with Malcolm X. Malcolm X went to her home to meet with atomic bomb survivors, and she was actually by his side when he was shot and assassinated. So in 1982, the Congressional Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians issued its findings in a report which it titled Personal Justice Denied. That Congressional Commission concluded that the incarceration of Japanese Americans had not been justified by military necessity, but instead was based on race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Keeping the memories of the incarceration and Executive Order 9066 alive is important. President Harry Truman said in 1946, "You fought the enemy abroad and prejudice at home, and you won." This imposes a mandate on Japanese Americans, including myself, with a moral authority and responsibility to speak out when other groups are unfairly targeted because of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, or other identity or forms of oppression. Having once been victims of such discriminatory policies, Japanese Americans are keenly aware of how these policies play out. And those experiences require us to use our voice with special authority and responsibility to speak out for others. The Constitution was and is still a visionary document, never really fully fulfilled or achieved, but always strived for. It's a vision of equity, justice, and freedom, which the founders tried to capture in words. So, okage-sama de, I am who I am because of you, my parents and ancestors. My forebears fought to protect the Constitution on many different fronts, on the battlefields abroad and at home, and that's why I continue to fight to protect it. So on this 80th anniversary of the Day of Remembrance, please take a few moments to reflect on our democracy, how fragile it is, the people who brought us to where we are, how we'll carry that responsibility forward, how a failure of political leadership can be disastrous, and how we can recapture and nurture that vision of liberty and justice for all that the words in our Constitution draw us toward. So thank you for listening to me, and please vote for adoption of this resolution. Thank you, Mr. President.